Library, and I look out at the audience and think, half of you are related to B.H. Roberts, 25% know somebody who's related to B.H. Roberts, and the rest of you wonder who in the heck B.H. Roberts is. So if that's not the case, let me know, but it is nice to be in B.H. Roberts' home territory. And I see names outside, Randall's, Ford's, and other folks who were important in B.H.'s life. I was up to visit the cemetery a few years ago, and like any other nerdy, boring historian, I walked around and said, oh, there's Belgrade, oh, there's, and it brought them all back to kind of life for me at least. I'd also like to say one other thing about my former colleague at Weber State, Richard Roberts. His father was Harold Roberts, and Richard, who was born in 1932, was the last baby blessed by B.H. Roberts. And I used to say to him, and shake your hand because then that goes to your dad, and that goes to the old man himself. And he'd said, yep, that's true. Rob was a good guy. He's done a history, he's passed on, we miss him. He did a history of the B.H. Roberts family. And if you haven't seen it and you're interested in it, you'll find it to be very fascinating. I had to change glasses because I have the option of either seeing you, as lovely as you are, or seeing what I've got on this paper. And if I don't see this, I'll be wandering all over. So you want me to wear these readers. Let's talk a little bit about B.H. Roberts. Roberts was an important figure in what my friend Tom Alexander calls the era of transition in Mormonism, from 1890 to 1930. And during that period of time, B.H. Roberts was a missionary, he was a general authority, he was a writer, a speaker, a historian, a theologian, a politician. He was many, many things, and he played an important role in that period. The day after he died, the Deseret News observed within him was a hunger to prove and experience life. It captured him well. In fact, I wanted that to be the title. The publisher said, no, it's not going to work. It captured him well. It's the two halves of that equation, theory and experience, philosophy and action, that embody Roberts in his approach. He explored ideas, he tested conventional thinking, he sought to understand both his religion and the world around him, then proclaimed his views forcefully and widely. That's the kind of person Roberts was. Historians like to read other historians except where they find a sentence that they wish they had written. And I found one of those the other day. It's from Ron Chernow's masterful and very long biography of George Washington. And this sentence resonates with me in regards to Roberts as well as Washington. He said this: the furnace of ambition burned with a bright, steady flame inside that diligent boy. By any ordinary standard, he was an exceedingly smart man with a quick ability to grasp ideas and showed a steady capacity to acquire and retain useful knowledge. Oh, I wish I'd written that sentence. Boy, that's a good one. I've literally spent most of the current century trying to understand B.H. Roberts. Now, I know the current century is only 23 years old. I get it. But it's a long time to spend on two projects, actually. First, I spent some time editing Roberts' diaries that cover the period with some gaps between 1880 and 1898. They were published as History's Apprentice by Signature Press. And most recently, I spent way too many years working on this book, B.H. Roberts, A Life in the Public Arena. The folks from Signature are here tonight. They have copies of this book. They also have copies of an autobiography that Roberts wrote. And my good friend Deborah Anderson will be happy to make you a good deal on a copy of each, one or the other. Okay, as a biographer, I'm driven by the need to understand my subject. All biographers are. It's arrogant to assume that I understand completely B.H. Roberts. I don't. There's an apocryphal story about one of the historians of Thomas Jefferson who said, I can tell you what Thomas Jefferson was doing almost every minute of his life, but I can't tell you what he was thinking. And I'm sort of that way with Roberts. I know where he was, what he was doing, but sometimes I wonder what was in that head of his. Like any biographer, Chernow, whomever, I have an ambivalent relationship with my subject. Why am I ambivalent? Well, Roberts was clearly a brilliant guy, but he could be a little bit difficult. He could be petty, he could be vindictive, arrogant, self-important, and I must say at times a little bit insufferable. A January 4th, 1898 diary entry reads, home, Salt Lake City, chess, and Dante. Okay, I get it, pal. You're a hotshot intellectual, you're not a couch potato like I am. You know, don't rub it in. But more to the point, Robert struggled with alcohol, and it affected his behavior and judgment sometimes. He battled depression, the black dog, he called it, which sometimes made interpersonal relationships difficult. He wasn't the greatest husband or father, and he admitted it. And as we will see, his views on women's suffrage were hardly enlightened, even for his time. Aha! He was a real person like you and I, with good things and flaws and all of that. So on balance, I view him as amazing, if occasionally annoying in various ways. And when you consider his rise from the grinding, abject poverty of his early years, followed by his life on the margins as a young man in Utah, it is truly amazing that he became one of Mormonism's great intellectuals. And I must admit I admire him for one thing. When Roberts was committed to something, he was committed to it. At age 60, he became the oldest chaplain in the Army, and he refused to be treated differently than anyone else in basic training. I was impressed. I had to admit at age 60, a long time ago, I couldn't have done it. Indeed, I barely survived basic, and I was 22. So he was committed and determined, and he made his way through it. After his death, the missionaries he led in the eastern states and some other friends erected a grave marker inscribed Churchman, Soldier, Statesman. It's in the Centerville Cemetery. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's pretty interesting monument. All of that is accurate. He was that, Churchman, Soldier, and Statesman. But my triptych tonight is a different one from those three. I want to look at politician, polygamist, and public intellectual. Recognizing some of you know Roberts' story well, others not quite so well, let me give you a little bit of a quick overview of his early days. He was born in 1857 in England to Mormon converts. His mother, Anne, was a committed Latter-day Saint, while his dad, Benjamin's Mormonism was at best perfunctory. Eventually, Anne realized and knew that her husband would object and never change in terms of his commitment. So she decided in 1862, with the help of what was called the Perpetual Immigration Fund, to flee England from Utah. Taking two of her younger children with her, she left 12-year-old Mary and 5-year-old BH in the care of local saints. Mary's situation wasn't very good. BH's situation was far worse. He was put under the charge of a couple called Tovies. John Tovey and his wife. Unfortunately, his wife's name has been lost to history. They were a poor, wandering, alcoholic couple who at various times tried to get rid of BH. They even offered him once to the Army as a drummer boy. It was a hand-to-mouth existence, from which Roberts ultimately was freed. And he ran away from the Tovies all the time and lived on the streets in abject poverty. Had he gone in the Army, or the other option he thought was going in the Navy, we wouldn't be here today. We'd be over there at that picnic enjoying a nice summer day, because we wouldn't know anything about Brigham Henry Roberts. But finally, his mother was able to reunite Mary and BH after a long trip across the ocean and across the plains. They arrived here in Utah, in Salt Lake City, in September of 1866. As this group traveled down Immigration Street, which is today's 3rd South in Salt Lake, and turned on Main Street. Young B.H. Found himself at the head of the train. Let me read to you what he had to say. He later recalled that he found himself at the head of the lead yoke in the team, walking up the principal street of the city, the rest of the team following. Here the people had turned out to welcome the plains-born immigrants and were standing on the street sides to greet them. Along the road, he said, I saw a charming little girl approaching me in the middle of the street. The dainty little lady offered Roberts a basket of peaches, plums, and grapes. Roberts took what he supposed was a reasonable portion, shared them with his older sister, then resumed his place at the head of the train. And he said, I marched on until the head of Main Street was reached. I find that to be a very captivating and illuminating scene. One senses that for the first time in his life, certainly in a long time, perhaps ever, Roberts felt he was home. And that sense of belonging, geographically and spiritually, would mark B.H. Roberts for the rest of his life. Despite the conflicts, defeats, and occasional disappointments he experienced, B.H. Roberts was, to his core, both a Latter-day Saint and a Utah, even if by adoption in both cases and not birth. We'll talk about some of that later. Well, the story's pretty interesting. After coming to Utah, Anne married a widower named William Nichols, who she had actually met on her trip across the plains, though it's not clear that she was formally divorced from Ben back home in England. Well, Mr. Nichols died after she had a child with him, and she married Seth Dustin and had her last child with him. Apparently, there was a divorce finally between Ben and Anne in 1898, a long ways down the road. Well, B.H. joined his mother living with Seth and what he called Seth's unruly sons. And in a church talk in Ogden in the 1930s, he reflected on that period of time. And he said this, I joined up with a gang of whore thieves, and for a while I roamed the hills in the back country. I took my whiskey straight and my coffee black. But it didn't last too long, as I saw no future in that. Then I got a chance to work with a blacksmith. Indeed, in the midst of this unruly life, rowdy life, a blacksmith named James H. Baird from Bountiful gave Roberts a chance to apprentice as a blacksmith. He lived with the Baird family. It gave him stability that he lacked for 3 or 4 years, taught him a skill. It led him to the one-room schoolhouse of Hannah Flint Holbrook, then to John Morgan's Commercial College in Salt Lake City, and finally to the Young Men's Club of Centerville, where he found a library full of books and journals, and he encountered ideas, and where after much effort he mastered public speaking. He describes his first attempt at public speaking was not particularly successful. At age 20, he married Louisa Smith, daughter of William R. Smith, who was the Davis State President, Smith Park up the way, and his plural wife, Emmeline Levitt Smith. With the financial assistance of the bishop and others, Roberts attended the University of Deseret, where he blossomed. He'd found where he wanted to be. He received what was called a territorial superintendent's scholarship, which was repaid by teaching for a period of time after graduation. Roberts became the valedictorian of the class of 1878. His selection by school president John R. Park was resented by some of his classmates who came from far more wealthy and prominent families and well-off circumstances than his. He used to walk to the University of Deseret for his classes, and then for a period of time he lived in what he described as a hovel down in Salt Lake City. He had one suit, and he felt very much like he was still on the margins, even if he wasn't taking his whiskey straight and his coffee black. But finally, Park said, listen, he's the best student here, he's going to be the valedictorian, and he made the speech. Roberts said he went back from making the speech feeling like it had been a dismal failure. And as he passed by Joseph F. Smith, who was there, he said to Roberts, son, them's my sentiments too. And even though Roberts and Smith would clash in the years ahead, over politics. That sense of assurance from the general authority made him feel like maybe he had done okay after. Okay, the 3 Ps now. Let's talk about politician first. Not long after that graduation, Roberts taught school, fulfilling the requirements of that scholarship. Then he left for his first mission. Initially, that first mission was in Iowa, but the climate was hard on his sinuses. I can sympathize with the situation. So he was transferred to Tennessee. It was there in August of 1884 that 2 Mormon missionaries, John H. Gibbs and William S. Berry, and several local members were murdered at a little place in Tennessee called Cane Creek. Roberts, disguised as a tramp, old clothes, an old hat, blackened face, had shaved for a couple of days, retrieved the bodies of those 2 missionaries and had them returned to Utah. He had to effect the disguise because the people who killed the missionaries knew what he looked like, and he felt like he might be the 3rd victim. Well, this event, returning those missionaries to their homes, gained press attention, certainly here in Utah, but literally throughout the United States, everywhere from Atlanta to Boston to San Francisco, mentioned this event. At 27, B.H. Roberts was a household name among the saints, for sure, and his prominence after that event, combined with a predisposition, led him toward politics. Roberts was known as the blacksmith orator because of his apprenticeship, and he supported what was then called sagebrush democracy, the Democratic Party of Territorial Utah. Most of his political activity was here in Davis County. He was elected to the Constitutional Convention from Davis County, and it was there that he opposed women's suffrage. Well, the Democrats had declared at their territorial party convention, state convention and here in Davis County, that they were unequivocally in favor of women's suffrage. Roberts was specifically advised by the First Presidency and other church leaders not to impede passage of a women's suffrage clause in the Constitution. Despite that endorsement, despite that advice, B.H. acted on his own and did oppose women's suffrage. He said it caused much outrage among what he called our prominent ladies. He knew there was overwhelming support for suffrage in Utah, although he was not the only one who opposed it. There was opposition, and it broke down on male-female and party lines as well. Well, why would he oppose something that was so overwhelmingly popular? Well, he argued that his main concern was that by adding a women's suffrage plank in the Constitution, it would make it dangerous to acquiring statehood. He said Congress will use that plank to deny a statehood yet one more time. And if you know anything about territorial Utah history, the territory tries to get statehood several times. Well, he couldn't just leave it at that. He had to speak more on the subject. At one point, Roberts told the convention, there was not a suffragist among you that has a higher opinion of women than he did. Moreover, he told his colleagues that the influence of women as it operates upon me never came from the rostrum, it never came from the pulpit with a woman in it, never came from a lecturer's platform with women speaking, it comes from the fireside. It comes from that blessed association with mothers, sisters, wives, daughters, not as Democrats or Republicans. That bothered the suffrage forces, male and female alike, but particularly female. And of course the amendment didn't say any of that. It simply allowed equal voting, regardless of gender. But he couldn't leave it alone. So finally he raised the question of the role that suffrage might play if it were granted to women in terms of domestic happiness. It was probably one of his most ill-considered and intemperate remarks, and yet was probably honest and revealing about how he really felt. He asked his colleagues on the floor of the convention to imagine a man who returned home after a hard day from struggling to elect a candidate which he believes will serve the interests of the people. Coming home from the sweat and heat of a campaign meeting, tired and weary of the world, only to be met at the door by a wife opposed to him politically, thus forcing him to either go over the fight again on the issues of the day or to, quote, observe a sullen silence because of the impropriety of engaging in a discussion along these lines. Gentlemen, he told his fellow delegates, leave the home alone. Keep political strife out of it. Women of Utah, be content to reign over the empire of domestic life, and it will bring more joy to your hearts than all the success you could have in casting your ballots at the polls. Well, needless to say, his remarks raised the ire of pro-suffrage forces. Ultimately, the plank was adopted overwhelmingly, as was the Constitution itself with that plank in it. It was not B.H. Roberts' finest moment, and he aspired to political office. So after the convention and statehood sets into motion elections, there was an election for Congress in 1895, and Roberts decided he wanted to be elected. Well, the question of women's suffrage dogged him throughout the beginnings of the campaign. He repented and offered a mea culpa time and time again. No, I've seen the light. Nobody would be a stronger defender of women's suffrage. I'm on your side, etc., etc. A lot of women, particularly Republican women, didn't buy it, but he made the try. The real issue in 1895 wasn't women's suffrage. The issue was the coinage of silver at the ratio of 16 to 1. That was a big political issue in the country. The argument was you could back money either by gold or silver using that formula, 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. I don't know if that works today or not, but that was what they said then. Well, that was a very popular issue in Utah. Who wouldn't expect it to be an unpopular issue in Utah? Tintic, Eureka, Park City. There was a lot of silver mining going on out here. And so he had the support of those folks. He lost a very close race as a young man, and he did really well in his first time out. He was 38, as I recall. But his candidacy led to conflict with church leaders. Roberts and an apostle named Moses Thatcher were criticized for seeking office without, quote, consulting the brethren. Well, Roberts believed he had the permission of Joseph F. Smith to run, and said so. No, I got permission. Well, he was urged to repent from his words and actions against general authorities on political positions. Well, this has been brewing for a long time. It had started with his conduct in the Constitutional Convention. Most of the church leaders at that time, not all, but most were Republicans, particularly this new generation that was coming into the church leadership, Joseph F. Smith and others of that generation. And so they were upset with him anyway. All of this came to a head in the spring of 1896. Roberts' ecclesiastical activities in the First Presidency of 7 were suspended, and ultimately, Roberts apologized for his actions and asked his colleagues to bring him back into the court. Thatcher, however, never did apologize. In April of 1896, at General Conference, a political manifesto was passed. It says that before accepting any position that would interfere with the discharge of ecclesiastical duties, leading church officials should apply to the proper authorities to determine whether he could function adequately in both positions. Roberts thought he'd like to give another shot, and so he ran again in 1898, and he was convinced he could win. In the first state election for president, the Democratic candidate running on the question of 16 to 1 received 80% of the vote in Utah. That's the Democrat. Even Mitt Romney didn't get 80% of the vote when he ran against him. So Roberts said, hey, we're on a roll here. I can get elected. Well, he ran again in 1898, and convincingly he won with 5,600 votes more than the Republican candidate. He carried 18 of Utah's 27 counties. He carried Salt Lake, Utah, Weber, Davis, others. And he received more Gentile support than he did from Latter-day Saints. In other words, more non-Mormons voted for Roberts than Mormons did. And he was a known polygamist. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But everybody knew in 1898 he had 3 wives. Okay, so he's elected, fair and square. And almost immediately calls were raised for his expulsion. This raised some difficult constitutional questions. whether or not a duly elected representative could be denied his seat. It also raised some interesting questions. Several representatives were flabbergasted. 3 mistresses? 3 girlfriends? That I get, but 3 wives, I don't get that. William Randolph Hearst, his newspapers, and evangelical Christians here in Utah and throughout the country were at the forefront of preventing Roberts from entering Congress. They assumed that denouncing him was by extension not only battling polygamy, but it was specifically opposing Mormonism as well. Ultimately, 7 million signatures were gathered and presented to the well of Congress. Congress faced 2 choices, realistically. Either seat him and throw him out, or not seat him at all. And ultimately, there wasn't enough support, and so he was simply not seated. Kind of a familiar ring to it, isn't it? Who knows? Well, Congress has the right to decide the members of the body. It's Congress and Senate. So anyway, he was not seated. And he ruled the day. He told one of his missionaries, Henry D. Taylor, he said, I've been a pretty darn good representative. They missed me. And I think he's right. I think he would have been a great representative. He was smart, he was articulate, he was honest. Even Joseph F. Smith, who he battled with politically, said, this is pure and simple politics. There is no better man in America, even though we have our political differences, than B.H. Roberts. Okay, politician. And that effectively ended his political career. He thought about running for governor once after that, and kicked around another campaign or 2, but he never ran for office again. So let's take a look at that second P of polygamous. Polygamous, as I indicated, he married Sarah Louisa Smith in 1878, and he married Celia Dibble, an important Davis County family, in 1884. Celia had been one of his students, and it was Celia that was my colleague Richard Roberts' grandma. And every time he looked at a picture of Celia, he said, oh, there's my sweet grandma. Well, he was only about 3 when she died, but I guess he had a pretty good memory. Roberts went to England to escape prosecution for that second marriage. He came back from England and served a prison term for unlawful cohabitation, short prison term, 3 months in a territorial prison. He gets out and goes back. By then, he's made a member of the First Council of 70. And along comes the Woodruff Manifesto. I edited those diaries, as I said, with some gaps, and unfortunately, as we'll see, there isn't a diary for 1890, which proves to be a very important year. He writes a reminiscence in 1893 about that period of time, 1890, 91, and 92. He says in that reminiscence that he learned about the manifesto while he was returning from southern Utah on a church assignment, along with Apostles Francis M. Lyman, John W. Taylor, Abraham H. Cannon, and John Henry Smith, a couple of Democrats, a couple of Republicans. Robert says initially the Spirit said to him, that's okay, it's fine, it's all right. His companions were divided, whether or not the manifesto was a good thing or not. They were divided. And then Roberts began to reflect on all of the saints, including himself, had suffered, including imprisonment, defending the principle. At the October conference, he said, in what he called the awfulest moment of his life, he could not and did not vote for the manifesto. He was pretty independent, Gus. His third wife was a woman named Margaret Curtis Shipp. Margaret is an interesting individual. She was a medical doctor, at least in the terms of 19th century medical doctors. The key question isn't whether or not he married Margaret, but when he married Margaret. That's the key question. Robert, for the rest of his life, that marriage took place in April of 1890. And it was performed, he said, by Daniel H. Wells, who he said had married him to Celia as well. Well, Daniel H. Wells died on March 24th, 1891. Despite his assertion, and Margaret's for that matter, Most scholars believe that this marriage was a post-manifesto marriage. Estimates range from 1891 to 1894. Although there's one estimate floating out there that says he didn't actually marry Margaret until 1918, when Margaret's first husband died. Well, that's hooey. It was somewhere in that period after the manifesto. We don't know. In his family history, my colleague Richard Roberts quotes an administrator of the Church History Library as saying that B.H. likely used Wells as a deceased but plausible man in authority to protect the person who really performed the marriage. They were probably married sometime between late 1892 and 1894, and the manifesto 1890. The marriage was post-manifesto. There's probably no existing paperwork to prove that marriage. And there's agreement among all scholars on that. When it happened, nobody really knows. But is there a document that says when it happened? Apparently not. And Roberts could be a very disingenuous individual. In late 1884, he was asked by reporters, he was bringing what were called the Tennessee Saints from Tennessee out to Colorado, as it turned out. Initially Utah, but land was cheaper in Colorado, so they settled in Colorado. In that period after that murder of those two elders and those members, a reporter said to him, do you believe polygamy to be legally, morally, and theologically right? He responded, the reporter said, with a frank answer to the question was that he did. But when asked if he practiced it, he replied, not literally or personally. Roberts said from Mormons it was an article of faith, not necessarily an article of practice. Well, he married Celia earlier that year, so he was shooting fast and loose there. Polygamy was a difficult question. A difficult question. We haven't got time to get into a big discussion of polygamy, and I don't know it as well as many other people do, but it was a tough question. What to do with those wives? How do you support them? What about if you married them? It was very difficult. Okay, third P is public intellectual. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there are a lot of definitions for that term, public intellectual. For my purposes, I believe this. A public intellectual is someone who engages in intellectual pursuits, expounds intellectual concerns in a way that a broad, literate public can understand them, and is seen by the general public, not scholars, academics, specialists, by the general public, as willing to comment on many different topics and concerns. And clearly, that was B.H. Roberts. What was the process of this young man becoming this important public intellectual? One of the most important were missions. I told you he served in the southern states for a period of time. They were very much a part of him becoming a public intellectual. He went on several of them after Tennessee at the request of the first presidency at various times to various places in the country, expounding on the faith and refining his views as he did. He was growing as he made those talks on the missions. And he was always attracting press attention. I learned one important thing from this long, long study. Whenever Roberts hit town, the newspapers covered him, particularly after he'd been thrown out of Congress. And whenever he appeared in town, the missionaries and members that were there wrote in their journals and wrote home to their wives and children, guess who was in town? B.H. Roberts. There was a lot of interesting information in that. From 1922 to 1927, he led the Eastern States Mission. That was a very important assignment that took him to the major centers of influence in this country, in the Northeast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and Washington, D.C. He was opposed in that calling by J. Reuben Clark. We'll talk about Clark again here in a minute, who said to President Grant, you don't want to raise the old issues of the expulsion from Congress and all that. No one sent him. Grant said, thank you, Brother Clark. I appreciate your input. He's a great missionary. I think he'll do a great job. And he did. He got back to New York and looked around the mission and said, these missionaries haven't a clue what they're here to do. I'm going to create schools, teach them about the gospel, show them there's more to a mission than if their cousin comes through, they take a few days off and go and visit. No, they're going to run this tight. And those missionaries recognized he was a tough mission president, but he was fair, and he was really concerned with them. You know, there's a concept about leadership. That leadership is a combination of authority on the one hand and authenticity on the other. And I think B.H. Roberts had that. He obviously had the authority to serve as the mission president, but he had the authenticity. He'd been on missions. He'd been chased down by mobbers. He'd been threatened with tar and feathering. And those young missionaries listened because they knew. He not only talked the talk, but he walked the walk. Okay, missions were an important thing. Another important step in the process of becoming a public intellectual was his effort to gain a hearing for the church at the Parliament of Religions, which was held in 1893 in Chicago during the World's Fair. He said, you invited everybody of every world religion except the Mormons, and that's not fair. And ultimately, the organizers didn't want to invite him, but they said, okay, tell you what we're going to do. There's a meeting way out in this part of the thing, nobody will hear it, you go there. And Robert said, no, I want a main platform. And they said, ain't going to happen. And he said, really? And you've got other religions? He said, well, we're worried about polygamy. Manifesto 3 years before, and you've got other Eastern religions, all of them practice polygamy. That's not your way. Well, it gained huge publicity for the church. And mostly favorable. Most people thought that the church had been treated unfairly. So that he was able to grow during that period, and state his case, and all that sort of thing. In addition to that specific time, Robert spoke widely throughout the church. Stake and word conferences, special meetings in the tabernacle, also many other political lectures. And again, most of them were reported in the press. I had the chance to interview Cal Rampton, our former governor. Cal was a shirt-tail relative of Roberts through marriage. And I said, what do you remember about, he was born in 1913, so he knew Roberts. He was 19 when Roberts died. I said, what do you remember about B.H. Roberts? When he came up from Salt Lake to speak in conference, he would take the train up, get off the train, and walk up to the ward. People following him just as if he was the Pied Piper. They would follow him all the way up and stuff like that. I said, well, that's interesting. What else do you remember? And I'll tell you another Cal story in a minute. He said, oh, I remember the day that he was speaking at the platform, and he was making his points like this, and he hit the podium, and his bridge popped out of his mouth, and caught that bridge, popped it back into his mouth, and didn't deter him at all from making the next point. Great story. Happened here in, Bountiful. Here in Bountiful. Well, apparently it happened in Pocatello, it happened in LA. He was a very ambidextrous authority. Well, anyway, and obviously there is this voluminous writing, histories, polemics, theology, even fiction, bad fiction, but even fiction in books and in magazines and in newspapers. Roberts was somebody that was accessible to a broad audience, certainly in the church, but also around the country as well. And finally, I think in understanding how this unlettered individual, who I read Dante and played chess, how he became this public intellectual. And that was World War I. Roberts was an early supporter of the war. Wilson's war to make the world safe for democracy and to end all wars. How's that worked out? Too well, huh? But Roberts came home, despite that support, a changed man. He became a ferocious advocate of world peace. He was the strongest voice in Utah in favor of the United States joining the League of Nations. And the church authorities were divided on the question of whether or not to support the League of Nations. The foremost opponent to Roberts was the same person who didn't want him sent to the eastern states, J. Reuben Clark. Roberts' last major address, just literally a couple of weeks before he died, was on the topic of world peace. So it's something that he never deviated from. Well, he's an interesting individual. Leonard Arrington called Roberts the intellectual leader of the Mormon people in the era of Mormonism's finest intellectual attainment. That's a pretty good amount of praise. Roberts was not a trained historian. He was not. But Arrington recognized that Roberts, despite not being a trained historian, significantly influenced the way most Mormons at the time thought about their history because he made use of primary sources. He edited the journals of Joseph to produce church histories, and he was fascinated by Novel. Anytime he was somewhere where some of the saints who had been in Novel were around, including the prophet's brother William Smith, he made sure that he spent time picking their brain. So Arrington understood what Roberts was trying to say to Mormons at that time, more than 100 years ago. You can't understand church history unless you get it from the documents themselves. You know, I believe, I'm not really a Mormon historian, but I'm not dabble in it from time to time. I think Roberts built a foundation for what we've called over the past 50 years, the new Mormon history. And that new Mormon history is very much geared to the notion that the answers to the questions are indeed in the sources. Another guy who knew Roberts was Sterling McMurray. Sterling lamented the lack of interest in Roberts for many years, and he celebrated the emergence of interest in the 1980s. He called Roberts the most interesting and exciting and stimulating person in church leadership, its most prolific writer, chief theologian and historian, and its most capable defender. He also told an interesting story again about Roberts at the pulpit. Roberts came down to the Adams Ward to speak not long before he died. And he was at the podium, and he was going like this. And the bishop said, Roberts, you need to speak into the microphone. And Roberts said, we have one of those back in the tabernacle, and I don't use it there. I don't need a microphone to be heard. He took his cane and thumped it on the podium. McMurray said, from then on, anytime there was a visitor to the ward, they would say, do you want to see where B.H. Roberts ended the podium? Who wouldn't want to see that? Well, Roberts was a complicated, controversial, and complex guy, no doubt about it. And he was an accomplished guy. He was somebody any of us would wish we had the chance to converse with. I spoke about Roberts at the SUP in Utah County a month or so ago, and a guy came up to me and said, I actually heard B.H. Roberts. And I said, wow, I'm jealous. Because as far as we know, there is no extant recording of Roberts' voice. Did he still have a bit of an English accent? I don't know. We haven't found it. And I said, well, tell me more. And he said, I was 98 years old. Or I was 9 years old. I'm now 98 years old. Wow, I said, what do you remember? He was a tired old man. That he was too, a lively 9-year-old. I can relate. Anyway, let me close this talk the same way I ended. Did I mention there are copies for sale? It's Mother's Day Sunday. They made great Kwanzaa presents. He deserves ongoing study. So let me quote the way I ended the book. The prominent American historian Eric Foner was asked once what he had learned as his study of Reconstruction had proceeded over the years. To paraphrase Foner, which I don't like it, he said the fate of all historians was that no book is the final word. They expect that their work will be challenged and eventually superseded by the work of others. As he observed, I have simply written the latest word, not the last word. Indeed. Well, I've minded the P's. Now it's your time to mind the Q's, as in questions. If you have some, or comments, stories you have, if you heard him speak, whatever, I'd be glad to hear them. And I'm going to switch to my glasses so I can see you instead of the page. Please.
I recently read a master's thesis by a woman in Kaysville who was all about Robert's issues with the Book of Mormon. And her position was the church sent him back to New York to kind of settle him down. Do you have any, in your research, any opinion on how he felt about that aspect of Mormonism?
Now, that aspect of Mormonism being...
The Book of Mormon.
Book of Mormon, yeah. Yeah, I've read that thesis. Shannon Montez is the young lady's name. And it's really good. It's very good. And it's a pretty good... Master's thesis generally are not real good, but this is pretty good. And she's a bright young lady and did a good job. It came out just as I was concluding my book, first draft. I presented my editor 900 absolutely wonderful pages of text. They kind of demurred and said, we're going to have to cut this down. I couldn't see a word in the 900 pages that I would cut, but they cut it. And they were not going to let me add stuff at that point when we were cutting it down. The other thing is, I'm not a theologian. I'm not. If you wanted to kind of get some insight on that question, I would suggest to you that you read Shannon's thesis for sure. It's really well done. She did some great research. And she said to me, I talked to her on the phone a couple of times, and she said, I think the church historian's library is trying to keep me from seeing things. And I said, well, could be. It also could be that the right hand doesn't look at left hand's doing. So don't take it too personally. I mean, they'd let me see some things and they wouldn't let me see other things. So I didn't take it too personally. But she did a good job on it and raises important questions. This is a book about Roberts in the public arena. As far as I can find, I find no statement where he says, in the public arena. I don't think the Book of Mormon is true. I can find times when he talks about the Book of Mormon, and more to the point, the divinity of Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's mission, almost to the day he dies. Now, having said that, as I said in the beginning, this was a guy who liked to consider ideas, think about them, figure it out, and then present his views. He liked to play devil's advocate. And I think he presented to the brethren some tough questions, and they could figure out the answers that they were going to figure out. Was he an advocate for some of this stuff? Yeah. I disagree that they sent him to New York to kind of get him, out of sight and out of mind. I disagree with that for two reasons. This was an important mission. And this was right before, it was in the 20s, and the coming of the Centennial. They wanted good press in New York, including 100 years ago today when Roberts said it was 100 years ago in 1823, that all this stuff happened in Cumorah, we need to have a centennial. And he did. But I lost it. Easy for me. Anyway, I don't know as a theologian. What I would say to you is, I would read The Truth, the Way, and the Life, which was his masterful work on theology. And I would read the works of others who know theology much better than this kid from South High School does. I'd read McMurrin and Leonard and some people like that.
Can I ask just a follow-up question?
Sure, absolutely.
She also puts forward that that the church tried to almost hide him for a number of years until his stuff came out in the 1980s, Brigham Madsen. And, as I've met with missionaries and things, when I bring up his name, they don't even know who he is.
Yeah.
And it's a real sad thing that he played such a key role in the church, and he's kind of forgotten.
Well, I think that there's some truth to that he's forgotten. It was forgotten. Whether that was a church program, they were also keeping in print the comprehensive history and the history of Joseph Smith, and most of his writings well into the late 20th century. I was in the DI today, and there was a copy of Outlines of Ecclesiastical History, and so for $2 I added it to my collection. So the writings are still in print. People are forgotten. Think about who was his contemporaries during that period of time and how prominent they were in later years. We all would still read James E. Talmage's works There were other intellectuals, Whitsoe, Joseph F. Merrill, Richard R. Lyman, others, and they were forgotten as well. And it was a reemergence, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it reemerges as that new Mormon history reemerges. And there's a lot in what he wrote that I think was lost because it just wasn't kept in print, that is valuable to this day. So, I don't know, a historian follows the sources that are available to. And Shannon may have seen things that I don't see. And maybe if I'd seen some things she saw, I would agree or disagree more. But as I say, I'm no theologian. I'm a political historian. Please.
Yes, my great-grandfather.
Good. Tell me your name.
Bruce.
Bruce.
And my grandfather was Harold. Richard is my uncle.
Uncle?
And my dad and Richard were brothers.
Right.
And with this issue, we've heard this for so many years.
Yeah.
And in the family, I have studied that through, and there has never been one moment that BH hasn't didn't bear testimony of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon as it is. And we just get so much of this gobbledygook that floats around in the world in all aspects of people like attention. Let me just tell you a little funny story, and I've told this before. I taught seminary at Beaumont for several years, and some of the teachers have been down at BYU to a symposium, and at lunchtime, a lot of the professors and stuff have got together, and this is totally informal, so it was just kind of off the cuff for fun. Okay, and they come back and he said, "Oh, we talked about your grandpa," and I said, "Oh dear." And I said, "What did they come up with?" They said, "Well, they had a little informal survey. They were trying to decide who was the greatest intellectual that the church has ever known." And they said, and I said, "Well, what were the results?" And they said, BH was number one. And then Talmage and Whitsoe and some of those that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The prophet Joseph Smith was either fourth or fifth. And we said, they put the prophet Joseph Smith fourth or fifth. And he said, "Oh, that's what some of the others asked. How come he ended up fourth or fifth?" And I said, "Well, the prophet Joseph cheated. He got it directly from the Lord." So that was over the years, and it's a longer story than that. But as I taught seminary and everything, they found out that I was B.H. Roberts' great-grandson. There would be discussions, and then they turned to me and say, "And what would B.H. say about that?" And
Wouldn't you like to know?
I had no idea.
Sure. So your road would come through Sillito. Is there anybody that comes through the Liza? Any descendants through personal?
You probably won't find any that come through the Liza. Richard searched that out extensively to find out what's happened. We put flowers on the Liza's grave. We're the only ones that the three of us right here put flowers on her grave up there. But he hunted them out, and he says the only person he found was in the Midwest. And he says it turned out in the genealogy, in Liza's genealogy, and I haven't looked into it close enough.
Sure.
But this is what Richard said. He says, I have hunted that, and he said, I finally found somebody in the genealogy in the Liza's, and he says they were not only didn't know who B.H. was, they didn't know what Mormonism was, and the fellow that he talked to was a pastor in another church.
Yeah.
So what happened with the Liza's, we would love to know that.
Yeah. Well, there was real antipathy between those two families. Richard believed that, and he quoted his dad, that, see, after Liza died, he wired with the family and said, I'm on my way out. In Richard's view, they basically lied him back, said, don't bother. He said, hold the funeral and I did it. Well, they didn't. And he said, well, on the way back to New York, they stopped in Chicago, and B.H. and Margaret took out a civil marriage license. Now, I don't know whether they were actually married, but they did take out a license. That I can find, but a marriage ceremony, I can't. And Richard said, my dad said to me, the old man made bastards out of the bunch of us. And I said, well, okay. I wasn't going to fight Richard on much of anything. Richard and I had a pretty good relationship. One time, one of my colleagues in the department went to Richard and said, I need to tell you that Sillito has a potty mouth. Richard said, oh, he said, I heard the other day swearing. So Richard called me in. So-and-so said he had a potty mouth. And I said, Richard, where in the blank would he get that idea? Richard just rolled his eyes and looked at his calendar and said, well, 3 more months and I'm no longer chair. He was a good guy.
Can I make one more?
Sure,
comment?
please.
As far as BH and our family and all that is concerned, I need to say this right.
Okay.
I believe God needed B.H. Roberts. But the family paid the price.
Yeah, and I think that's, the family did pay the price, and he says that finally, he does. I could have been a better father, I could have been a better husband. There's one story in the book that, did I mention the book was on sale? Well, there's one story in the book that's pretty interesting in that sense. He goes back to New York on a mission in 1897, and he meets Leah Dunford. And B.H. is more smitten than any teenage boy I have ever seen in my life, including law. He is just a gaga. He just is so out of his league, you know. And he really, I think, wanted to have one more marriage. So she's the daughter of Susie Young Gates. And Susie says to Leah, you marry him, he's your age. If you think he's such a hot shot, she's saying, do you think of the children you bring? And she said, well, you marry him. She said, I'm not going to marry him. I'm not going to spend my life hiding as a polygamous wife and going to Canada and stuff like that. So he was a complicated guy that way. But I think that he finally in his later years realized that he should put more time into being a better family guy. But in his defense, he had 2 families that he had to support. At one point, B.H. Roberts was selling insurance, Jordan. He was also one of the first quarters. He had some expenses. That's part of the reason he wrote as much, too. It was a pretty big gig. Well, as I say, complicated, controversial, interesting guy. Some people say to me, well, you really know how you feel about whether or not he lost his testimony in the Book of Mormon and in Joseph's. I said, I really know, I tell you, I don't really know. Because I haven't seen anything in my research that would suggest that. Now others have. And I don't think that, again, I don't think anybody's written the last word on that, just in case. Richard used to say, you're part of that crowd. Leonard Arrington, George Smith, and all that. Richard, I don't understand theology. Anything that ends in an OG, I don't understand. Theology, biology, archaeology, genealogy, it ain't my cup of tea. Or posting, I guess. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Yes?
One more.
Okay.
Thank you.
One for each wife.
Yeah. I think you presented.
Thank you. Richard would say to me, here you go again, you're chasing after me. I'm going to write that biography. And I'd say, Richard, write it. Go ahead, go for it. And I do this way too. But I would like to think that if I ever on the other side get the chance to meet B.H., I would hope he'd say, you did pretty good. You did pretty good. And then I would say, okay, buddy, sit down here a minute, let's talk. I got a couple of questions for you. Please. Yeah. Be interesting to know.
Yeah.
He has 2 homes here in Centerville. Any comments on them?
I'm not an architectural historian either. I know that one stands still, and it's not too far away from here. It's really an interesting home, and I'm glad that the homeowners have recognized the historical nature of the home, and there's a plaque and all that sort of thing. This was really for many years where he considered home. And even after he married Margaret, and he lived mostly in Salt Lake, he would still come to Centerville to be with both Eliza and Celia at various times. So I can't comment to the architectural significance of the homes, but I do know one's standing and one isn't. My good friend Alan Roberts, who is an architectural historian, we had a signing of the books, and the first thing Alan said to me is, "I can't believe you wrote a book that big, and there's no mention of these homes." Me either. So I know the ones here, I'm glad it is. And this was really home, in many ways.
The first one was Eliza's,
First one was Eliza's.
and then the other one was Stephen's.
Was Stephen's.
How come you wrote this book? I mean, you got Truman Madsen's book and Gary Guerra's book. Did you feel that something was missing?
Yeah, I did. And no criticism of Truman Madsen's book. No, there's another one by a guy named Robert Nayland, too. They're both valuable. If you're interested in B.H. Roberts, you should read my book. Did I mention to you that was You should read my book, but you also should read Nayland's and Truman's book as well. The problem, the circumstances with Truman's book is that it is not footnoted. And so you have to take certain things on faith. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying there's not a footnote to lead you to where he knows. For example, he says that Roberts' marriage to Celia was not consummated at the time of the marriage. Well, kind of like see the source on that one. And so there's that. On the other hand, Madsen talked to all kinds of people who knew B.H. Former missionaries, his secretary, whose name has just gone totally out of my Elsie Cook, his secretary, all kinds of people. And he gathered those stories. But there's no way of going back to his sources and saying, okay, I read it this way, you read it this way. So that's my criticism. But you can't understand Roberts without understanding Truman's book and Roberts' own autobiography. There are problems with Roberts' own autobiography, which are causes incident to age. He remembers years long, and he's in Sioux City, and he says he's in somewhere else and stuff like that. But again, that firsthand documentation is valuable. Somebody said to me one time, if I wanted to read one thing about B.H. Roberts, what would it be? No, they said, besides yours. I said, well, I'll tell you what I tell you. His speech on the floor of Congress, justifying his position in Congress, is a masterpiece. This was a very bright guy, and he made some wonderful constitutional arguments. And how anybody could listen to that speech and not say, I don't agree with polygamy, but let's see this guy. He's a decent guy. And it is really, really something. But yeah, dealing with B.H. would take those into account. And I quoted both of them liberally. And one of the early readers said, how can why is he called Madsen? How do we need this book? And the answer was, well, he quotes Madsen not uncritically, and says what I just said to you. You can't necessarily check the facts. Another editor said, I like this book, and I said, why? Every newspaper article ever written about B.H. Roberts anywhere is in these 900 pages. And many of them are not going to stay.
With so little formal education, how did he become so prolific in writing and speaking?
He was a lifelong reader. He was what we would call in education parlance a lifelong student. He was a voracious reader. And he said, you know, I'll give the old lady Tully one thing. They weren't the most stable couple, but she taught me to read. And she got me religious books and newspapers. And she taught me to read. I'll credit her for that. There were a couple of times when I wished I wasn't there, but she gave that ability to me. And he really was one of those kinds of guys that wanted to know things. He believed, I think he believed he had a place and a purpose, and he worked to do that. I'm a great fan of a guy named Michael Harrington, who was a political writer. Roberts was a little bit like Michael Harrington. One of Michael's critics said to him, Michael, is it not enough to have read the most important writings that you have to say he also read them in the original German? And B.H. was kind of like that. The tougher the subject, and some people disagree on his interpretation, he's got it wrong. Boy, you give me stuff that challenges me. That's how you do it. Other comments, questions? You've been a wonderful audience. Again, thank you for the invitation, and I hope I cross your paths down the road. Thank you.